Again, establishing a level of hijab. Alright? Now, all of these things come together, and I'm just giving you just a few examples because the time is so limited. All of these things come together to create a definite concept of hijab within the masjid. And there's no doubt among any scholar, right, that hijab needs to be established and is essential to the functioning and the purity of the masjid. That's very, very clear. Now, once that was established during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the next thing you have to recognize is that after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, the hijab deteriorated. In various ways, the hijab deteriorated. Now, when the hijab deteriorated, Hazrat Umar radiallahu an made a decision that, or Hazrat Umar radiallahu an made a ruling. And his ruling was that women are no longer permitted during his time to come to the masjid. Now, Hazrat Umar radiallahu an recognized that the Prophet ﷺ permitted women to come to the masjid. That he made a ruling during his time that women should not come to the masjid because of the fact that the hijab was no longer at the level that it needed to be, at the level that it was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So what was his ruling? Basically, understand his ruling in a very simple way. His ruling was that the permission that the Sharia grants for women to come to the masjid is predicated upon the proper hijab existing within the masjid. That hijab is two people's responsibility. It's the male's responsibility and the female's responsibility. There's no just doubt about that. Both genders hold the responsibility for hijab, but Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu ruled that the permission for the women to come to the masjid was predicated upon the hijab being established in the masjid. Now that's a very big ruling, because that ruling conflicts an open statement of the Prophet ﷺ which says that do not prohibit women from coming to the masjid. So here you have on one hand Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu ruling that women cannot come to the masjid during his time. And on the other hand, you have this clear statement of the Prophet ﷺ, so clear, do not prohibit women from coming to the masjid. So what happened? A conflict arose. The women said, what are you talking about? A group of women said, how can you prohibit us? This is a clear statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And here you are openly going against that statement. So they took their complaint to the greatest scholar in the history of the Deen, Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha. Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha is considered the greatest scholar in the history of our Deen. Why? Because she knew the inside and the outside of the Prophet ﷺ. She knew what was going on at home. She knew what was going on outside of the home. So she is considered the greatest scholar of the Deen. Now when the women of Medina, that group of women of Medina, took that to Hazrat Umar radiallahu an, to Aisha radiallahu anha, she said to them a very, very famous statement, and this statement is preserved in the book of Imam Bukhari, in which she said that if the Prophet ﷺ saw the way the women of today come to the masjid, he would have prohibited them from coming to the masjid the same way that the women of Bani Israel were prohibited from coming to the masjid. That's her general statement in the book of Imam Bukhari. Basically saying what? Saying that this fatwa that Hazrat Umar radiallahu an gave, that the permission of the women to come to the masjid is predicated upon the establishment of hijab, she said, I stamp my approval on it. So she stamped her approval on it. Now, once that was established, no other Sahaba complained. None of the Sahaba complained. Meaning, they all stamped their approval on that fatwa. So that it became a general principle within the Deen that for genders to interact within the masjid, for genders to both come to the masjid, a hijab is required. Alright? And that's the accepted position of the scholars. Because look, the Sahaba were not a passive people. The Sahaba were not a passive people. They fought each other on the battlefield based on their interpretation of the Deen. Based on their interpretation of the Deen, they fought each other on the battlefield. They shed each other's blood based on their interpretation of the Deen. So they would not stand quietly if Hazrat Umar radiallahu anh was breaking a rule of the Sharia. No, they did not make that distinction. Allah's rule is Allah's rule. So if he were to be breaking a rule of the Sharia, they would not have stood quietly, but when he passed that ruling and when he implemented that ruling, they were quiet and accepted that ruling because they too recognized that actually the permission of the Prophet ﷺ was predicated on there being a proper gender division. Okay? Now, this ruling was not a ruling against women, which is what people fail to understand. Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu was not ruling against women, but he was ruling against the situation that the genders had created within the masjid. Men had to pray in the masjid, so how could he prohibit them? Because it's wajib for men to pray in the masjid. Women have increased reward at home, so it's easier for him to say to the women that it's better for you to pray at home. Now that's the first thing. The second thing is that you have to also recognize that what was the home in that day and age? In that day and age, the home was just as good as the masjid. People used to pray their farad in the masjid, and then they used to go home and they used to pray their sunnahs, and it was just an atmosphere of deen. They created mini masajid within their home. They used to recite Quran regularly within their home. So a person could easily develop within the masjid as they could within the home. Now also as a further proof that Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu's ruling was not against women, but that it was against the lack of the barrier, is the fact that on other occasions Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu, in other ahadith, permitted the women to come to the masjid. For example, in Ramadan on one occasion, Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu created a separate tarawih prayer for the women and had a separate imam lead the women when the men were not praying there. Okay? So they were coming to the masjid, but he created the hijab in a different way in that circumstance. Similarly, in another narration, we find that some women were permitted by Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu to come to the masjid for Fajr and for Isha. In particular, one of his wives. Right? Now again, the same issue there. Because they were coming for Fajr, they were coming for Isha, there was darkness, right? They didn't have lights in the masjid at that time. There was no electricity. There was pitch darkness. Alright? And at the same time, they were coming with proper modest clothing and dress. So Hazrat Umar radiallahu anh permitted those women at that time in that circumstance to come because of the fact that hijab was still being preserved. But the general idea that you get from this up to this point in the history of the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ is that for genders to come to the masjid, there is a requirement for division between the males and the females. Now, at that time, homes were like the masjid. People recited Quran in their homes. People prayed in their homes. It was basically an atmosphere of the deen. Slowly over time, the home began to deteriorate. Right? As the home began to deteriorate, the ulama said, wait a minute. Now if women don't come to the masjid, there could be a potential deterioration in their deen. So, the ulama suggested, the scholars of our deen suggested establishing a barrier between the men and the women. Right? They said, one way to get around this issue of improper hijab, we've been trying, we've been telling the males, lower your gaze, it doesn't happen. Some of the males inadvertently, their gaze goes in the wrong direction. We've been trying, we've been telling the women, come dressed modestly. Unfortunately, a few of the women come dressed immodestly, or they may not have that same background and same experience that we have. They may be coming to the masjid for the first time, or they may rarely come to the masjid. And so, how can you convince them? It takes time, right? So, basically, the scholar said the way around this is to establish a barrier between the men and the women. There should be a distinct area for the males, there should be a distinct area for the females, and there should be an absolute barrier between the males and the females. Alright? So that's also a way of translating hijab, which basically means barrier. Now, that has been our tradition throughout the entire Muslim world, across time and across culture. Throughout the entire Muslim world, you go to various places and various times, and you look historically, and you'll see that that division has existed throughout our time and across our cultures, in order to protect the masjid and to keep it a place of purity. Now, one of the arguments that people come up with, and they say, is that how can you put up something that didn't exist during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So here the scholar said, one way to solve the issue is to put up a barrier between men and women. So how can the scholars advise that a barrier be put up between men and women when a barrier did not exist during the time of the Prophet ﷺ? Okay, granted, there was no barrier per se during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, in that there was no wall dividing the men and the women.